Redditors who clean up crime scenes, what's the most bizarre thing you've witnessed? I was at this house cleaning up a suicide. It was a beautiful young woman in her 20s who had killed herself with her prescribed antidepressant. The investigators had left, so it was just me and my partner there. We just had to put her in a body bag and take her to the morgue. I went out to the ambulance to get the body bag stretcher. Walk back in the house to see my partner aping the girl's corpse. The strangest part is that he seemed like a totally normal dude. I would have even said we were friends. He's in prison now. Just trying to do my part to get actual crime cleaners here, but I'm a medic, so similar I guess. One time we found this guy dead in his home in the corner of the living room, tucked around the couch. Ass up, no cloths on. Literal coffee ground looking shit spread everywhere across the house. On the floors. Furniture. Walls. Everywhere. Along with mass amounts of liquor bottles and glass everywhere. He had massive GI issues along with drinking himself to death. Don't know what was worse. The smell or the scene. A friend of mine is a firefighter and he told me about a scene of a wreck he showed up to. When he arrived, there was a Corvette smashed under a trailer of an 18-wheeler. When they finally pulled the two apart, the driver of the Corvette's body was intact in the front seat with cell phone in hand. Meanwhile, his head was in the back seat. Turns out he had been going at least 70 miles per hour while texting and didn't realize there was a red light and rammed into the back of an 18-wheeler. I don't clean them for a living, but had to clean a few apartments when my uncle managed an apartment complex. We had one tenant OD on heroin. He sat there for roughly 3 weeks before anyone noticed the smell. They took his body and left it to us to clean up. The dude vomited on the ceiling. There were little dry droplets of vomit all over the ceiling right above where he died, and to top it off, he basically liquefied and left a puddle of gut juices on the concrete foundation underneath the carpet. I thought that shit was left to a professional team. But I guess it's optional, and if you don't want to pay for it, you can scoop the brains and blood up yourself. Was dispatched to a vehicle versus pedestrian call a couple months ago. And when we arrived on scene, it was like something out of a movie. Dude was running across a fairly busy 4-lane road and was hit by a car traveling about 55 miles per hour. After his head went through the windshield of the first vehicle, he then proceeded to be thrown into the opposite lane and was ran over and dragged about 20 yards by another vehicle. Once the coroner was on scene with traffic investigations, we proceeded to pick up his organs bit by bit. It was a fantastic anatomy lesson. My best friend used to have this job. Most of the bizarre stuff was cleaning up suicides. Found a guy's full intact mustache across the room when he blew his head off with a shotgun. One guy tried to kill himself by shooting his stomach with a small caliber pistol. He didn't die immediately, so he wrote tons of whacked out stuff on the walls with his blood. Then finished the job. I occasionally work on the weekends for a funeral home. It's decent money for what is essentially 2 hours of call out work when their normal staff is off. Last year I was called in at around 5 in the morning. A 30-something-year-old guy had killed himself, shot himself, in a pretty small 2-bedroom apartment. That wasn't the bizarre part at all, since I've seen it before on call-outs. What was bizarre was what was in the apartment. Literally thousands of documents. Piled on the floor. On a desk. On shelves. Of people's financial information. Credit card statements. Bank statements. Personal data. Etc. Probably 3,000 folders with all this stuff in it. Even where there weren't piles of folders. There were just loose papers. Magnetic cards. Surveillance cameras. It was just the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And of course, some of these documents and folders had blood and brains spattered all over them. Didn't matter to me though, since the detective on scene had said it was fine to take the body. The police had to clear a path by collecting the papers from the route we would take from the door to the apartment to where he was. A couple of months later, it came out that the guy had over $1 million in cash and Bitcoin. Apparently the state police were onto him. Family member did heavy duty cleaning, including crime scenes. A guy shot his head off with a shotgun. EMTs were supposed to pick him up, literally, but missed a large chunk of brain behind a couch. That was when said family member decided to find other engagement. I can relate to this. FFEMT. Respond to suicide with a rifle. He dead. Nothing for us to do but pronounce. Cops cover the body. Then want to escort the family out of the death scene because everyone is processed like a crime scene regardless, and it is the only way in or out of the property. Before they did so, though, my partner had to point out the guy's remarkably intact brain just sitting in the tree over his body. I don't clean up crime scenes, but I do remove the deceased. I can get into more accurate detail of the deceased, but here's some general stuff. Hoarders are a lot more common than they really should be. First of all, and it's never a clean hoard. It's piles of junk covered in several types of urine, shit and vomit. Molds I've never seen before. And probably insects that haven't even been discovered yet. I understand when the emergency services don't want to be in that kind of house longer than they have to. But I'll never forget having to ask them to help me because I couldn't distinguishing what was actually the deceased and what was just a piles of random shit that looked more human than the deceased did. People will warn you bodies will bloat, and touching them the wrong way will make them leak. But the image you're conjuring up doesn't even hold a light to what it can be like. Insects skittering when you delicately lift a 400 pounds deceased onto your cot. Because one wrong move and they will start oozing. Oh. And the ones who had pets who were so desperate they had to eat their owner. Staring into the eyes of a big, brown-eyed mutt who is happy to finally receive human contact. And all you can't think about is how the deceased is missing their entire face. Poor things were just hungry. But it's unsettling. Crime scene cleaner here. My first suicide cleanup was quite an experience. Man shot himself in the head in his garage. I'll never forget needing to use pliers to pull teeth and skull fragments out of the drywall behind where he sat. All that blood and brain managed to make its way more than 50 feet across the garage. Most disturbing though, was his pickup. We chose to take it to our company wash bay to pressure wash it and make sure it was as clean as possible. I cleaned it myself and was satisfied that I had done well. Inspected for blood and couldn't find anything. So I began driving it back to the owner's garage. On the way back a slight drizzle began and switched on the wiper blades. Imagine my horror as a chunk of brain streaks across my newly cleaned windshield. I pulled over quickly and cleaned it up. But it still makes me sick to think what would have happened if it didn't rain that day. This man's poor wife or daughter would have been met with that sight and been crushed again by the impact of suicide. That 10 years ago and I'll never forget it. Now I triple or quadruple check every job. My father is in a similar line of work. One day he told us about a gaming dude who died while gaming. He had no one that cared enough to check out on his absence. The dead body was found when the neighbors complained about the horrible stench coming from the dude's apartment. It was like a week-old dead body of a fat person sitting in a gaming chair surrounded by food wrappers, pizza boxes, soft drink cans, etc. He even pissed and shit in a bucket. Now whenever I take my food on my gaming table my dad tells me that you're gonna end up like that guy. Not a crime scene cleaner, but reading this thread and threads like it really helped me affirm that I can't kill myself. I've struggled with depression PTSD for years. Had one almost attempts and many more planning sessions. I get all the no one would miss me thoughts. They'd be happy if I was gone thoughts. But every time I think of the trauma someone else would face, even if I believed my family hated me, I can't do it. I don't like to call it selfish, but even in my lows now, I think of the EMTs, police cleanup crews who would inevitably carry some trauma from the scene and I just can't. As terrible as many of these stories are, they've helped me. Here in Texas, one of my relatives, as a teen, was cleaning a gun with a friend over that he didn't realize was still loaded and blew his own head off. You'd think there were people, crime scene people, that would come in and clean up for the family. And while there are companies that do this for a fee, they couldn't afford it and all his brothers and sisters and other family members had to do it. One of them is broken inside and describes it very detailed. I can't imagine having to clean a loved one's skull fragments and brain matter off the walls. This was before I became a part of their family and when we would visit. From when my son was just a baby he would not go in this room. He didn't even know what happened yet. I do not clean up crime scenes, but the company I work for receives newly wrecked cars and resells them in auction. My job is to clean and inventory the car for upcoming auction. I can tell you now that I have seen some f-ked up and creative ways people go to commit suicide in their vehicle. We call them suicide cars. Now I won't go into vivid detail for the family's sake, but I had an SUV last week in which the back seats were all down. The floor and seats all covered in well placed and folded blankets. And the front seats even covered in trash bags. The door jambs has folded towels for extra cleanup, and the cover the back to small windows with a type of window tarp, and they committed suicide laying down and pointing the gun towards their head, so limited splatter went throughout the car. Just yesterday we had a very much 100% mangled truck in which a young child was killed. I was told not to open up the black garbage bag inside the vehicle due to brains and skin being inside. Yo, I see some shit. Please be careful on the roads. I don't clean up crime scenes for a living, but my car got stolen by a homeless drug addict and later recovered by police. And I was shocked that when they returned it, crashed. Not in driving conditions, that they left everything in there for me to clean. I had to pull out an entire pill container of oxy, several used needles, heroin, and other disgusting shit. I had no idea how to dispose of it safely. Can I offer a sincere thanks to anyone who does this for a living? When my mother committed suicide in the garage, we called a company the police recommended. The company was very respectful of the situation. They literally cleaned that 2x2 piece of garage down to scouring the floor. Think scorched earth level cleaning. I don't think anyone in my family was emotionally ready or able to enter that garage to clean up what was there. Again, thank you for being strong for those of us who cannot. My pops was a funeral director for a while. Family biz. He had stories very similar to some of these other ones. Hoarders who were overweight and filled with decomp gas. You have to basically spear them to let the gases out in order to get them out the door. An old man who was a shut-in died in front of a huge southern-facing bay window in the summer. Took 2 weeks for anyone to notice. And they found out by smell what happened. My dad and his crew had to go in like full biohazard outfits. He said he was able to do and handle a lot. Clear bodies from suicides on train tracks, murders, etc, etc. But one of the hardest things he had to deal with was a young girl had been raped and murdered. And that same week, a dad in his 40s who died of a massive heart attack while putting the star on the Christmas tree in front of his family. My dad had recently become a father at the time, late 1970s. My older sister was about 2 at the time. After that he was pretty much done with the family business. Started working in sales. I think it shook him a little. One story I won't forget. He had to pick up a body of a guy who was working on his house's siding and hit a nest of hornets. They stung the guy so many times in the face and neck. Some got into his mouth and stung his throat. He suffocated to death. And was blueberry blue from the oxygen deprivation. My dad told me this when I was 7 and we were cleaning out a wasp nest. Needless to say, I had a crippling fear of anything with a stinger for a solid 5 years. Like, what a shitty way to go. Had a drunk homeless guy sit on the train tracks behind my house back. There was a giant chunk of carcass plus a million little pieces that sprayed all over the station and tracks from when his body got sucked up and shot out the engine like a meat grinder. It was where we used to walk our dog, and I just remember going there a couple days later and finding things the cleanup crew missed, like toes. What looked like a pancreas but turned out to be his overly oxygenated brain. We found a sock with the skin from his foot still in it. My stepdad called the FBI and told them what we found, so the next day I had to meet them there. They explained the craziest shit to me, like why his brain looked like that. I was 15 lol. Not me, but I knew someone who worked at the medical examiners. One of the cases was a man who had passed away in his home. Can't remember how. But anyway, he had been there a couple days. The body had been there long enough for it to start to swell with liquid, and when she went to turn him around, his arm popped like a freaking water balloon. Friend of a funeral home owner here. Back in the day, Funeral home employees had to show up to the scene of the death and pick up the bodies. Many stories were told, but one stood out the most. Motorcyclist failed to yield to a stopped semi, ran into the back of it and died instantly. When my friend arrived on the scene, the police were searching for his head. They thought he was decapitated. They never ended up finding it. When the mortician did the autopsy, they found the head in victim's stomach. He hit the semi so hard and head first that it was lodged into his stomach. Was a volunteer FF in a very small town in MO. Got an unresponsive person's call from dispatch and met with the local sheriff outside of an elderly home apartment complex. The unresponsive patient was a woman in her mid-50s. And her apartment door was locked. The lights were on in the house. The ceiling fan was on. The TV was on. The gas stove had a pot on the burner. Everything suggested that she was fine. Except for the flies on the inside of the windows. And the fact that the pot of water on the stove was glowing red hot. The lady's neighbor said that she had passed by a couple of times throughout the week and everything looked normal. But when she knocked on the door, nobody answered. The sheriff and I busted down the door and the first thing to hit us were the flies leaving like a cloud. The smell was extremely bad and continued to get worse as we entered her bedroom. There she was, laying in the fetal position on her made bed, covered in mucus and black, stringy goo. There was bloody mucus on the wall closest to her side of the bed, and next to her was a Tupperware bowl that she had been coughing up what looked like pieces of her lung. The coroner showed up and determined that it wasn't foul play and asked me to help get her on the stretcher so he could take her to the morgue. She had been for about 3 days. So the rigors was the worst part. Even worse than the smell. We had to physically stretch her out in order to get her out of the fetal position. It's a sound that I will never forget. And X200B. She was a heavy alcoholic and smoker. Apparently died from kidney failure. I'm a volunteer firefighter. Had one call for a vehicle fatality last month where a woman was ejected from the driver's seat of a minivan. She went through the windshield and landed on the hood. She hit the glass so hard that the tempered glass had mingled with her brain and neck matter, creating a sort of ball shape. There was blood everywhere, running off the hood and into the grass as well. It was storming that night, so a lot of it got mixed with the rain. But the weirdest part was how the windshield mangled with her brains. Dude rigged the whole room into a trapeze of some kind with pulleys and ropes everywhere designed to lower himself onto objects when he pulled his arms down. It had a toilet seat and such for him to sit on. Apparently the old school glass Gatorade bottle he was lowering himself on was too much. He ruptured something and bled out. So now I'm looking at a purple dead guy suspended by ropes and pulleys dripping blood with a Gatorade bottle stuck up his ass, and his family is screaming outside while a VHS tape of the animated Hobbit movie is playing in the corner. Fucking humans. I don't do crime cleanup for a living, but it sounds interesting. When I was younger, my neighbor's kid, kindergarten age, I was in 5th grade, got his leg ran over a lawnmower when he snuck up on his grandpa mowing the lawn. It was a massive bloody mess, the half the kid leg being shaved to the bone from his ankle to knee. Half of his calf gone, but somehow just missed the main artery on his leg. And he's rushed to the hospital via ambulance. Me and twin brother had to pick up pieces of his little kid's leg and throw it away so our dogs didn't try and eat it. I participated in one once. And the oddest thing was the feel of the room. It was a murder. The body had been removed. And the physical damage was limited to a small bit of carpet and subflooring in the closet. But the place felt heavy. Like you could feel in the air that something really bad had happened in that room. And I legit got the willies. And had to step outside for a little while. I felt really stupid about it all. But spoke to a few people who work more frequently in that practice. And they had experienced the same thing at one time or another. Finally my time to shine. Worked for a company that did exclusively biohazard remediation. Seen a lot of shit that others have touched on. Looked behind radiators to find an eyeball looking up at me. Found a 70s porn stash attached to a whole upper jaw on top of a bookshelf. Scooped up damn near whole brains from shotgun suicides. Had a dude who shot his dogs before himself. Worst was an unattended death in a trailer in the summer. Body was left so long he burst. Bio was sprayed everywhere. But that's not the worst part. Worst was when the bugs got to him. You couldn't set one foot in that trailer without stepping on 100 fly eggs. Maggots were everywhere in the trailer. My first suicide cleanup was from a Glock. Right in the mouth. All the bone and brain matter splattered everywhere. Even across all of their wedding photos. That's not the weird part. Though. Before he did it. He took off every single thing on his body and in his pockets. He folded all of his clothes to an almost military perfection. And set them on the dining room table in a perfect line. Watch. Wallet. Money. And all personal items in a similar fashion. Right next to the clothes. I often wonder what that brief period of time must have been like for him. While I do not clean up crime scenes, I do pick up the deceased at crime scenes after they have concluded their investigations. The most usual thing seen is blood, bodily fluids, waste leakage, the look of horror on their faces versus people who just look asleep. The most unusual thing I have seen at a crime scene is multiple people dead from gunshot wounds and a person laying in that pile without a scratch. Dead. That person was the shooter. Apparently he shot up everyone. And as he was reloading his clip, standing over the bodies, he had a sudden heart attack and collapsed right then and there on top of the victims. Talk about an agenda being suddenly cut short unexpectedly. Not me, but my dad used to work in mortuary services. Or the dead man taxi as he used to call it. Loads of stories, but the one that stuck with me was when he had to go pick up a suicide jumper who had landed on a wrought iron fence. Broke like every bone in his body. But didn't puncture anything on the fence somehow. The way my dad described it, it was like trying to handle a human beanbag chair. He and another worker both grabbed ladders on each side of the fence and lifted the amorphous blob of a body down from the fence. I typically clean up meth houses. But crime scenes and hoarding also occasionally pop up. A few months ago we were called in to clean up a stabbing. Guy got into a fight with his girlfriend and decided to stab her 14 times. At least once in the head. She actually managed to survive, but we didn't find that out until the end of the day. The first freaky thing happened when we started cleaning. When we clean up trauma scenes we typically use a chemical we call serum. It's basically hydrogen peroxide on steroids that bubbles up when it comes into contact with organic material. So we start spraying a clean looking hallway with serum and wait a moment. The serum starts to bubble like one footstep after the other. He had just enough blood on his feet when he left the room that he attacked her and that it left a trail. It just wasn't visible until we sprayed it. The other freaky thing happened when we were asked by the landlady to throw out the stabber's stuff. He worked in construction and owned a ton of tools and various boxes on his side of the room. We would open the boxes just to make sure the tools were his and not his employer's. We opened one of the boxes and it was full of knives. Combat knives. Swiss Army knives. And kitchen knives. Also, none of the kitchen knives were from the same set. It was one of those moments where you get a clearer image of who someone is. And who they are is terrifying. In the early aughts I had a roommate who worked for a funeral home and would sometimes get called in to take bodies to the coroner's office. On Halloween morning he got just such a call and he said it was the freakiest shit he'd ever seen. The woman was a very devout Catholic and she had been praying at her little prayer altar when she had a stroke or something and died. No one discovered it for several days, so when he got there she was all turning black. But she was still posed in a praying position. He took a Polaroid even though that kind of shit is strictly forbidden. He showed it to me. But she looked kind of slumped over. Still eerie though. Not me, but a buddy of mine. We'll call him Larry. His brother owns a funeral home and oversees the morgue at the local hospital. Sometimes Larry picks up the call-ins. Mostly late night. Well, one night he gets a call to a very rural part of hillbilly country. Larry arrives at the home but no one's there. Certainly nobody. He calls them back and they direct him to the barn on the other end of the property. Once located he gets out of his car to an officer who tells him he's not ready for this. Now Larry does this a lot. He's cleaned brains off of walls. Done autopsies on children, etc. So Larry's first thought when the officer said he's not ready was dumb little softy. Then he walked into the barn. A barn filled with puke. Puke and shit. Chicken shit. And human shit. Puke. And shit. And feathers. And one human male corpse covered in puke. And shit. And feathers. And a chicken corpse stuck on his dick. This guy was raping a chicken when he had a heart attack. Larry said the smell was so unbearable that he walked out and called his brother and told him to hire someone else. He quit. I don't clean up crime scenes, but my driver's ed teacher in high school was good friends with a DUI homicide photographer. The guy would come scare the kids every semester with gnarly pictures of people involved in fatal DUI accidents. The one picture that never left me was the motorcyclist who hit a pole face first going 100 miles per hour. His body literally wrapped around the pole. Like completely inverted, so he was inside out and his ribcage spine were fully visible. It was like human wrapping paper. Not my story. Essentially a friend of a friend's. Someone called 911. Reporting a stench in a flat below them. EMTs and the like show up. Find a guy who had been left in the apartment for a couple weeks. The guy had drank and Drano. The drain unclogged stuff. There was a trail of blood leading across the bedroom. And his body was crouched in a corner. Both his hands were at his side. But it looked like he had a hand coming out of his throat. It was his digestive organs which had essentially exploded out of his mouth when it came into contact with the Drano. I'm an estimator for a biohazmat crime scene cleanup and restoration company. While I usually don't go on site, I do have to pick through the extremely detailed and graphic photos of the scene to determine what we will charge for the cleanup. Of course there's blood, brain and bone matter, and other bodily fluids covering the surfaces of the rooms where people die. What's shocking to me is how many people just want it cleaned and will return to the home immediately afterward. A son shoots himself in his mom's bedroom. And once we're done with the mitigation, she'll be back in that room in 2 days. And X200B. Also, the price. We bill the homeowners or insurance companies usually no less than $25k due to the specialty equipment and processes we have in place to do the cleanup. It's so expensive. And what I hate the most is sending these grieving parents or victims an astronomical bill for cleaning up a suicide or murder. It just seems so wrong. We have to get paid. Of course. But I don't think I'll ever be comfortable with that. Not me. But a friend of mine interned at the local ME office. One day shared with me that they were called on scene to collect a body. Guy died of a heart attack completely naked on the couch surrounded by porn movies. Last thing he yelled at his wife was, "Just leave me the FCK alone," before shutting himself in his den. The weird thing was his wife hadn't checked on him for a couple of days and just left him there before finding him and calling the police. Oh. And there was a cat box in the corner of the room with crap in it. The wife reported that they have no cats.